Hello and welcome everyone to Absolute Trust Talk. I'm Kirsten Howe and Madison Gunn is here with me today. We don't have a celebrity death to talk about today, unfortunately, or a celebrity estate plan. However, there is a celebrity, what would you call it, situation that we read about recently that sort of inspired this episode, which this is actually going to turn into a series of episodes that we are calling Character Matters, and you can put the emphasis on either one of those words and it still works. Madison, why don't you talk about the celebrity situation and then we'll get into our content.
Yeah, sure. So I am a huge Housewives fan, guilty pleasure. And one of my favorites that I've been watching from the beginning is Housewives of Beverly Hills. And one of the long-standing women on the show is Kyle Richards. She is from a famous family. Her family is married to the Hiltons. And she was a child actress and is still acting. And her husband, Mauricio Umansky, started a real estate firm shortly after they were married. And it has blown up into this huge company. It's actually called The Agency. So I would say a huge agency, but it's called The Agency. Good marketing. And they are currently separated. And so there's a lot of no one's bashing anybody in the news. No one's, it's all very keep the family together. But my thought process is she was the wife while he was building this business for 30 years. That's a lot of what we would call goodwill. And, obviously the firm is him, right? He's the face of it. He has all these agents under him, but he's the owner. He's the broker. And so we were talking about what would happen if they do get divorced. If someone does file for divorce, that might be his business. It might not have her name on it as an owner. I don't think she's a licensed real estate agent, and how that works. So we were talking about how just because his name might be on it, she's still entitled to half.
Right. Because she is a housewife of Beverly Hills.
Right.
They live in California. We are a community property state. Okay. So that was the interesting story that brought us to, we got to talk about community property and what does that mean in separate property and why do we estate planners care so much about that? So I think first we're going to start by just talking about what is community property, what is separate property, what the heck are we talking about?
Yeah. There's a lot of confusion. So we just want to lay it out simply for everybody and go through that.
Right. And so just as a basic concept, whether something is community property or separate property, that is its character. And that's why we call this episode or this series of episodes Character Matters or Character Matters. Character means, is it community or is it separate? In this context, that's what we're talking about.
Right. Okay. And the character is defined by the definition, not necessarily by any other action. And we'll talk about that more as well.
Right.
Okay. But to start, it's handled by its definition.
Okay. So let's go, Madison, kind of walk us through.
Okay.
The definition.
reach back to law school. Community property. So everything is either community or separate. Community property is anything that you acquire from the date of marriage to the date of separation or death, whichever comes first. And separate property is anything outside the marriage, so before date of marriage or after date of separation, and anything during marriage that is inherited. You inherit it by yourself. It is gifted to you, not to you and your spouse, but to you. So those are exceptions. Are there other exceptions that I am missing? Yeah. Okay. Just gifts and inheritance. So that is separate property. And then technically separate property is something that should stay separate. And then community property has both your names on it.
Okay. And also important to bear in mind is that if something is separate, the income from it also is separate. The growth and appreciation on it also is separate. Same with community. If something is community and it generates income, that income is community property as well.
Right. And then there is something called what we call a community property interest. So that means if you have separate property, let's say it's a house, because this is the number one example that we explain to clients, right? Yeah. I inherited this house and then 10 years later I got married, but it's still my separate property. Only my name's on it. My spouse isn't on it. That's separate. She can't get it, right? So maybe. The problem is were you using separate property to pay all the expenses on this house, or were you using your income during marriage to pay down the mortgage or to pay the property taxes or to put a new roof on
Put in
it?
a roof. Mhm.
Capital improvements, things like that. Are you using her income to do that? Or is she putting any money towards the house? So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's now a 50-50 asset. That's not what we mean. You're not changing the character. It is still separate property. But when you go through a divorce, typically there is a balance sheet and you just move money from
And
column to
yeah,
column. And
the spouse might have acquired a right as regards that
right,
separate.
if there's been $100,000 of community, I'm not gonna pretend to talk about growth or interest or anything like that. But let's just say $100,000 of community money was put towards the separate property asset. The other spouse might be entitled to that $50,000 in their column
On their ledger, or
on
yeah,
their
on their
ledger.
side of
Yeah,
the ledger. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So why you just talked about divorce. So that's the easy, obvious example of why one of our clients should care about understanding what's community and what's separate. Because if you get divorced, that's all going to have to get fleshed out. And
Right.
so it's important to know from that standpoint. But there are other reasons why it's important to clients to understand what's separate and what's community.
Yeah. So the big thing would be is when somebody dies, which is what we're in the business of,
That's our
not
business.
typically in the business of divorce. But that is if somebody dies and they don't have an estate plan, there are intestacy laws. We talk about that. There's a plan for your assets if you die. If you don't have a plan, the law has a plan. But that plan is different for community property than it is for separate property. So when you die, your community property goes 100% to the surviving spouse.
If you don't have
If you
a written plan that says otherwise.
Right. You have no documents
Right.
when you die. Your community property generally goes to your spouse. Your separate property is going to depend on whether or not you have children. Or siblings. I think it goes out to siblings. If you die and you have a child, your half of your separate property goes to your child and the other half goes to your spouse. If you have two children, two children or more, I should say, your children get 2/3 and your spouse gets 1/3 of the separate property.
Right.
And if you don't have kids, I believe, and you have siblings, then they get half or a third.
Or parents.
Or parents. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It only goes that far.
It will only go out that far.
Yeah.
And then it would all go to the spouse if there isn't any more close relatives. But
right. It's not going to go to your first cousins.
Right. Right. But the important point is that that probably isn't in many cases what the decedent would have wanted for spouse and children to co-own the house that the spouse lives in. That's usually not a good result.
Especially if it's not that spouse's child.
Right. Yeah. Most especially. Yes.
Yeah.
But so it's important. It's very important to understand that, just because you're married, that doesn't mean the estate plan is going to work the way or the California probate code estate plan is going to work the way you think it will. That's an important point. But there are other reasons too.
Yeah, there are benefits or not benefits, depending on how you want to look at it. There are things to weigh. Anything that is separate property is treated differently than community property when it comes to taxes.
Right.
So your primary residence, we all get a capital gains exemption for living in your home. So if you get a $250,000 per spouse exemption. So if you're not married, you only get or not if you're not married. If you're not married, you only get the 250,000. If you're married and you're both on title and it's your community property, you get 500,000.
Right.
So if your other spouse doesn't own the property because you've kept it separate, then you only get the $250,000 exemption. Just because you're married doesn't mean you get that exemption automatically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, only the owners get it. Yeah.
Right.
And the other thing, so that's exemption from capital gain upon the sale of the house. And the other sort of important point from our client's perspective is that the treatment of the capital gain on death. So the person who owns separate property, when they die, their separate property gets a new stepped up tax basis Stepped up tax basis is good. That's always good. We always want that. So you get that on everything that you own when you die. But if it's your spouse who owns the separate property and they die, that's great. But if you die and it's not your separate property, it's your spouse's separate property, it's not going to get a stepped up basis. So these are things that we talk to clients about when they're trying to sort through it.
Yeah. It's not uncommon for clients to say, what are the pros and cons of getting married? And these are the things that we walk through, although we certainly don't think that finances should play a part in why you're getting, or whether or not to get married, but they might play a part in, that decision, especially if you're talking about a silver marriage and it's your second or third marriage, at that point, do you need to get married? Some people.
Yeah. You want to know what all the advantages and all the disadvantages are, because you probably already know what a lot of the disadvantages are.
Right.
And you go to your attorney. Are there any tax reasons why I might want to think about getting married, even though I know what I know?
Yeah.
Speaking as a very jaded divorced woman. Sorry. Okay. So in our next episode in this series, we're going to get a little deeper into what community versus separate means in our world, estate planning. And so we're very glad that you were here today. I hope you learned something, and we will look forward to connecting with you next time.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Absolute Trust Talk Live. If you enjoyed listening in, then don't forget to subscribe. You can find us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you may listen by searching Absolute Trust Talk. While you're there, we would also love for you to leave us a review. And then why not share your favorite episodes with family, friends, or colleagues too? You can find all of our shows and corresponding show notes by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com. You'll also find a variety of other free resources, including our ebooks, videos, blogs, presentations, and more. If you need help with your estate planning or administration, we also offer a free discovery call to help get the process started. You can find more information on booking your session by visiting absolutetrustcouncil.com/scheduling. Don't forget to keep an eye out for our next live episode. If you join us for the broadcast, you can submit questions during the show. But if not, don't worry. You can always get in touch with us by sending a quick message to info@absolutetrustcouncil.com. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you soon.